Nonviolence: A History Beyond the Myth by Domenico Losurdo. Translated by Gregory Elliott. Published in 2015 by Lexington Books. Authorial note. For help with bibliographical research and for reading the text, I am grateful to Stefano Azzara, Paolo Ercolani, Giorgio Grimaldi, who also compiled the index, and Emanuela Susca. Introduction. From the broken promises of perpetual peace to nonviolence. In Germany especially, a festive climate accompanied the outbreak of the First World War. Photographs convey images of youth rushing to enlist with the enthusiasm associated with keeping an erotic engagement. Leading intellectuals and great swaths of the population felt the enchantment of what Max Weber called a grand and marvelous war. An exceptional witness described the spiritual climate of Vienna in the days immediately following the declaration of war as follows. Quote, each and every individual was required to cast his little paltry ego into the ardent great mass to be purified of any egotism. In that majestic moment, all differences of class, language, and religion were submerged in the great current of fraternity. End quote. The terrible ordeal facing the country dictated popular unanimity, a fusion of people's lives and consciousness never experienced before. The outbreak of the massive conflict marked, quote, an hour of the greatest solemnity, the hour of depersonalization, Entstellung, of integration into the community, gemeinsame Entrückung in das Ganze. An ardent love of community spread among people, and they felt powerfully united with one another. Having formed a brotherhood, they were ready to destroy their individual identities by serving. End quote, from Marianne Weber. The idiom of mystical experience employed by Marianne Weber here was widespread in the culture and journalism of the time. Men certainly hastened to the front in their readiness to die. But in Germany, above all, the dominant culture and philosophy celebrated the test of arms and readiness for sacrifice as a kind of spiritual exercise. The latter had supposedly extracted the individual from calculating rationality and the banality and vulgarity of everyday existence, realizing the communion of spirits hitherto rendered impossible by social conflict and attachment to material goods. Soldiers at the front were indeed forced to face sacrifices and privations and defy death on a daily basis. But this severe ordeal proved to be a beneficent pedagogy, which transformed callow youth, lacking in firmness, into men with a rich, mature personality and a more virile, more profound sense of existence. Crude, dour natures returned from the front refined, with a more acute sense of the values of community life and solidarity. Benedetto Croce anticipated a, quote, regeneration of current social existence from the war that had just erupted, and in which Italy had not yet intervened. But this mystificatory communitarianism of war, and this passionate quest on the battlefront for authenticity, intensity, and spiritual plenitude could not survive the subsequent painful mass experience. What awaited men in the trenches were mud, total regimentation, and death. It is true that across the Atlantic, immediately following the cessation of hostilities, Herbert Hoover, a prominent member of the American administration and future President of the United States, attributed a function of purification of men to the conflict that had just ended. But this was a belated, largely artificial reprise of a motif that now had little resonance in popular consciousness. 20 years later, not even the initial triumphant victories of Hitler's Blitzkrieg could recreate the enthusiasm of July to August 1914. Pace postmodernists, who missed no opportunity to ridicule the idea of progress, major historical experiences, which are often tragic, do not occur without leaving behind profound traces and more or less diffuse lessons. It is right and fitting to underscore the extremely tortuous character of the historical process. But to speak of progress ultimately means acknowledging the human capacity to learn and the irreversibility of historical time, the impossibility of reverting to a time before the historical experiences that marked entire generations. The magical atmosphere of July to August 1914 will never be recreated. What followed was a disenchantment that has left its mark. War cannot be compared with spiritual exercises, and cannot be welcomed as a festivity or a necessary positive monument in the process of the creation and maturation of authentic existence. In Hegel's terms, the experience of the seriousness and suffering of the negative cannot be erased. The same applies to revolution. In its time, the fall of Tsarism and the February days of 1917 were saluted in Russia as an Easter of resurrection. Christian circles and significant sectors of society expected a total regeneration from it, with the emergence of a spiritually renewed and intimately united community. There would no longer be room for the division between rich and poor, not even for theft, lies, swearing, and drunkenness. This prospect was given even more emphatic expression a few months later. Quote, "What is in the process of being realized is the fourth psalm of the Sunday Vespers in the Magnificat, the powerful overthrown, and the poor freed from poverty." Thus, a French observer, Pierre Pascal, who was a fervent Christian, greeted the Bolshevik October, while outside Russia, the young Ernst Bloch, in the first edition of The Spirit of Utopia, anticipated the disappearance of, quote, "commercial morality, which consecrates everything that is most contemptible in man, and the transformation of power into love." End quote. Such ingenuous enthusiasm, stimulated in February by the fall of an ancien regime that had become universally hated, and in October by the end, or beginning of the end, of a bloodbath now regarded by everyone as intolerable and monstrous, could not survive the emergence of contradictions and bloody conflicts without the new order. Like the mystificatory communitarianism of war and the celebration of the test of arms and life at the front in a spiritualist existential key, exalted revolutionary hopes of a total renewal of society and of human existence as such experienced the terrible impact of actual historical developments. In both cases, people underwent the indelible experience of the seriousness and suffering of the negative. The 20th century was punctuated by wars and revolutions that promised the realization of perpetual peace in different ways. Was punctuated, that is, by forms of violence that proclaimed themselves intent on eradicating the scourge of violence forever. In 1900, although peppered with massacres, the joint expedition of the great powers engaged in ruthlessly repressing the Boxer Rebellion in China was celebrated by the French general H.N. Frey as the materialization of, quote, "the dream of idealist politicians, a United States of the civilized world," end quote. As the advent of a world no longer marked by boundaries and conflicts between states. The unity of the civilized countries in the struggle against Asiatic barbarism encouraged such hope. In reality, 14 years later, the horror of the First World War was visible to everyone, and its principal protagonists were the civilized countries, previously summoned to guarantee order and peace via their punitive expeditions. But this was insufficient to dispel an ideology that looked to war to promote the cause of civilization and peace. In Italy, Gaetano Salvemini pleaded for Italy's intervention in the bloodbath that had just begun. Quote, "This war must kill war." It was not legitimate to abstain from, quote, "war for peace," to quote the phrase that supplied the article quoted here with its title. This was the ideology of the Entente, which, with U.S. intervention, was to be consecrated by Wilson. The defeat of the Central Powers, branded as synonymous with authoritarianism, and the consequent widespread diffusion of political liberty and democracy, had allegedly made the ultimate peace of the world possible at last. Lenin had no difficulty in demonstrating the mystificatory character of this slogan. Germany, which formed the main target of the Entente's crusade on behalf of democracy and peace, itself waved the banner of struggle against warmongering despotism, and waved it against a country belonging to the anti-German coalition, namely Tsarist Russia. Far from promoting ultimate peace, appeals to spread political liberty and democracy by any means did very nicely as an ideology of war on both sides. Served, in other words, to fuel an interminable bloodbath. Hence, in Lenin's view, the realization of perpetual peace must be pursued by a different route, starting with the destruction of the politico-social system which, in Germany and the anti-German alliance alike, had fostered expansionist and hegemonic ambitions, the arms race, and war. The roots of this scourge would supposedly be removed for good, following the worldwide triumph not of bourgeois democracy, but of socialism. However, historical developments once again turned out very different. Ultimately, the socialist camp broke up as a result of severe tensions, armed conflicts, and wars between countries that had left capitalism behind. Following the tragedies of the 20th century, and the broken promises of wars and revolutions alike, we are led to repeat with Kurt Valentin, comedian and friend of Brecht, quote, "The future was better once." End quote. The future no longer appears so radiant as to justify the violence, whether war or revolution, called upon to realize it. Let us be clear, we are not witnessing the disappearance of the amazing ideological constructs or grand narratives of the 19th century, referred to by Jean-François Lyotard. Progress, contradictorily theorized in this respect by postmodernists, i.e., the great critics of the idea of progress, proves partial and fragile. In our day, the deleterious consequences of the grand narrative, wherein the global spread of democracy, even by force of arms, would tear up the roots of war forever, thus paving the way for perpetual peace, continue to make themselves felt. In the name of this rousing prospect, devastating and sanguinary global policing operations are launched. However, although propagandized for and transfigured by a massive, sophisticated multimedia apparatus, these wars cannot elicit the unanimous enthusiasm and enchantment of yesteryear. The disappointments induced by the actual course of the 20th century prompt a state of mind and attitude that might be summarized thus. Rather than deferring it to a problematic socio-political future, would it not be better to practice nonviolence on an individual basis in the here and now? Why should recourse to arms to bring about change at home and abroad not follow the parabola of other violent practices, witch hunting, slavery, dueling, which flourished in the past but are now difficult to comprehend? Thus, in 1896 argued Leo Tolstoy, who, desiring and foreseeing a world without war, added, quote, "The time is near. All that will remain is a vague memory of war and armies in the form in which they exist today." End quote. This was a prophecy uttered a few years before the start of the 20th century, which was to see war rage for extended periods in every corner of the globe, in particularly monstrous forms. In 1905, while the revolution that was shaking the Tsarist autocracy in Russia was underway, Tolstoy ventured another prophecy, quote, Violent revolution has outlived itself." End quote. One cycle had ended and another had begun, in which the radical transformation of society would occur by peaceful means. It scarcely needs saying that subsequent developments, in Russia and elsewhere, radically falsified that prophecy as well. We are familiar with the blood and tears that have drenched projects to change the world through war or revolution, in very different forms and with very different results. Starting with an essay published in 1921 by Walter Benjamin, 20th century philosophy has engaged in a critique of violence, even when the latter claimed to be a means to just ends. But what do we know of dilemmas, betrayals, disappointments, and veritable tragedies that have befallen the movement inspired by the ideal of nonviolence? End of section.